Welcome everybody and everybody watching the video to tonight's study. Last week, wow, we had a great study last week. We saw the rise of David in Saul's service. He comes to Saul's service as a servant playing a musical instrument to ease these terrible evil spirits that the Lord sends upon King Saul. He ends up as a commander in Saul's army and ends up getting quite the reputation for himself, so much so that Saul tends to get a little jealous because the people are really, oh man. I'll finish my thought and then we'll get to that. He gets jealous because everybody's giving David all the credit and the accolades and Saul's not getting as many. But before we go any further, it is always good to go to God in prayer before we start studying. Thank you, my prayer mentor over here. Let us go together. Dear Heavenly Father, once again, here we are in your presence. God, it is a good time to be in your house today. Lord, we're going to learn so much about you and how you work through human hands, Lord, to make your will known and done in this world. God, King David is one of the most revered people in the Bible, and we're just so excited to learn more about him tonight as you have us on the cusp of learning more about how he comes into his kingdom. So God, we ask that tonight you be with us in a special way, Lord, that you touch us with the Holy Spirit in a way that enlivens our hearts, Lord, and our minds, creates within us that desire, that hunger to know more about you. Not just our minds, Lord, as we assimilate the information, but our hearts so that it finds good fertile soil and your word grows within us and it bears good fruit and we become good tellers of this story. So God, be with us tonight and let everything we say and do bring you honor and glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right, so we also saw David being chased relentlessly by Saul, and I actually edited last week's video this afternoon, and I was putting them, and I saw one part. It just made me chuckle. I got to go back over it again. We were talking about where David and his guys are hanging out in the cave hiding out, and Saul goes in there to relieve himself. And I said something like, "When that man dropped his pants, I would have cut his throat right here." Hilarious. I just had to laugh, but yeah, I would have. I mean, I wouldn't have been as reserved as David was. I mean, I'd have cut his. But anyway, yeah. But we see David ultimately prevail. Saul falls in battle. Which a Samuel, who was called back by a sorceress from the dead, he prophesied that Saul and his son Jonathan would fall in battle, and they do. That's where we pick up the story. We finished 1 Samuel last week. We're beginning in 2 Samuel this week, and that's where we pick up the story. Now, David doesn't yet know that Saul has died, so he's out on a whole different mission. Saul was battling the Philistines. He had picked a fight with the Philistines that he couldn't win because God was no longer on his side. He falls at the hands of the Philistines. Well, technically he falls at his own hands. He gets mortally wounded by the Philistines. He doesn't want to be known as the guy that got killed by the uncircumcised dogs over there. So he asked his armor bearer to kill him. The armor bearer couldn't do it. So Saul says, just give me if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. So he takes his sword, he falls on it, kills himself. The armor bearer sees that. He couldn't bear to live without his master anymore, so he kills himself. And there we are. That's how Saul dies. David, meanwhile, is over fighting an enemy of his own. He's fighting a group of people called the Ammonites, and he is victorious in that. He comes back to his home base, his town of Ziklag, and he's there for 2 days. And on the third day, this guy comes running from the battle that Saul has just died in 3 days earlier, comes running into camp. He's probably just sweating and panting and dust on it. It says he has torn his clothes and sprinkled dust on his head, which is, in the Old Testament language, is universal language for a sign of mourning, a sign of trying to think of the more modern word than mourning, but just you're mourning the loss of somebody. Grief, yeah, he's grief-stricken. He comes in and David says, "Where have you come from?" And he says, "Well, I've escaped from an Israelite camp." David said, "Well, what happened?" And he says, "Well, the men they fled battle. There were so many of them. The Israelites that were fallen by the sword, and so many of them died. And oh, by the way, Saul and his son Jonathan died as well. David looks at him and says, how do you know that Saul and Jonathan died? I don't know what was in this guy's head. I don't know what he was thinking, what he was drinking, what he was smoking, but he starts to tell a story. He says, well, I just happened to be hanging around up there, and I saw King Saul, and he was wounded. And he calls me over and says, hey, come here. And he says, and I go to him, I said, well, what can I do? And he says, who are you? And so I says, well, King, I'm an Amalekite. Same group of people that David has just been doing battle with. He says, well, I'm an Amalekite. And he says, well, I tell you what, I'm about to die, so run me through with the sword. Go ahead and finish me off. I can't bear the pain I'm in. He says, so I did him a favor, and I killed him. And David says, you did what? I killed the king. Now, we know, good readers, from last week's story, that that's not how it happened at all, and I just paraphrase that. The Amalekite wasn't up there at all. I mean, he might have been up there seeing this, but Saul wanted his own armor bearer to kill him, and when the armor bearer wouldn't, he said, well, I'll just do it myself. I don't know why this guy is taking credit for it. Maybe to curry favor in David's eyes, saying, Saul was in misery, and I helped put him out of his misery. Thought he was going to get some brownie points for that. Reminds me real quick of a story. The only job in my entire life up to this point that I've ever been fired from. I was working as a fireman for the town of Somerville, and we were a group that really liked to cut up and joke and have fun. Well, we had driven our fire trucks over to the city garage one day, and this is in July. It's hot as blazes out. Everybody went there because one of our trucks had been broken down and torn apart, and we wanted to look at some of the parts. Well, one of the guys from the other station climbed in the truck I was driving and cut my AC off and turned the heater on. Full blast in July, right? So we go to get back in the truck. It's 400 degrees in there. That's very funny. Or later that day, we had to go on a walkthrough of a local church. Actually, it was my home church that had built a new Sunday school wing. Well, while we were there, I took some white grease that we used to grease up fire hydrants with, and I went and put a good, healthy daub under every door handle of their fire truck. As luck would have it, they catch a call while we're there. Their driver, and I wasn't smart enough not to do the driver's door handle. Driver gets grease on him. Long story short, their truck captain got all upset because he had got bested. He starts, we could have wrecked, and the driver had wrecked. So the battalion chief gets called that night, comes and calls us all on the carpet. Next shift, the chief has us all in his office. Well, first the battalion chief, I want to know who's responsible for this foolishness. Well, of course, Troy Thomas had started it, so Troy raised his hand, and I had finished it. I raised my hand. Well, there's this guy on my crew who didn't have anything to do with it, and he raised his hand. He was like, me too. 3 days later, when we're all sitting in the chief's office, Troy got fired first. He got sent packing. He calls me and this other fella in and chews us for about 15 minutes and then hands us our walking papers. And this poor kid's like, but wait, Chief, I didn't have anything to do with it. It's like, you said you did. You're fired. This kid got fired for claiming something that he had nothing to do. And so every time I read this story, he got fired for lying. He's like, yeah, I was part of it. But he wasn't. I mean, same with this guy. This guy claimed something he didn't do, and guess what he gets for his trouble? David said, he says, why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? See, David still considered Saul as the anointed one of God. David wouldn't reach out and touch Saul, even when he had two opportunities to kill him. And so he's holding this Amalekite responsible for what he says he did. And so David calls one of his men, and he's, go strike that man down. And he did, went and killed him. And he says, your blood is on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed. So the guy tries to be a big shot, claims that he killed Saul, and ends up dead. And he might not even been there. He might have just heard the story.
He was killed for lying.
He was killed for lying. Meanwhile, David and his men mourn the death of Saul and his son. And it's just amazing to hear that this man, King Saul, was hell-bent on killing David, tried to kill him so many times, and yet now that David finds out that him and Jonathan are dead, he's willing to mourn over Saul. I understand mourning over Jonathan, that's his best friend, but to mourn over Saul after everything Saul had done, that takes a special kind of person. That's somebody that is able to put aside everything that's happened and still look and say, that is God's chosen. God declared that Saul would be king, and until that's no longer the case, I'm going to show the proper respect. We know that David was anointed king of Israel, king of the Israelites, because God got mad at Saul. But we also know that God didn't make him king right away. So there was a running battle there. Saul was still king until the day he died. There was a running battle there. Well, after he died, we can just assume that David just, boom, all of a sudden he's king over all Israel. Well, that's not how it happened. He ends up going to this town of Hebron, which is in the southern part of Israel, in the tribe of Judah. And the folks of Judah down there, they appoint him king. And they say, you're going to be our guy. Now, that's only for one part of the nation of Israel. Probably, well, it's one tribe actually. They would have actually, the biggest tribe, so they would have been a good portion of the tribes of Israel. So maybe about a quarter of the population now recognize David as king. However, in the northern part of Israel, we still have the household of Saul still going strong. You remember his right-hand man named Abner? That was the guy that was sleeping alongside him when David snuck in and had his guy steal the spear and the water jug, and he calls him out, "Hey Abner, how come you letting people sneak into camp?" Well, Abner is now, he's the highest military guy there. Well, he goes and grabs one of Saul's sons named Ishbosheth, and he makes him king in Saul's place. Because remember, the kingship was kind of set up to be handed down from generation to generation within one family line. Even though God's already anointed David, and God says David's going to be the next king, these people are taking matters in their own hands. So now we have two kings in Israel. We have King David, who the tribe of Judah has pledged their allegiance to. We have King Ishbosheth, which all the other tribes are following, and he's going to be their king. As a way to try to hash this out, the commanders from both sides decide to have a little peace treaty, not a peace treaty, a peace summit. And so they get together at a pool outside of a town called Gibeon. David's men sat on one side of the pool. Ishbosheth's men sat on the other side. But now David nor Ishbosheth is there. You have Joab, which is David's supreme commander now. He kind of runs David's armies. And then you have Abner, which is the in charge of all the Israelite armies. So they're sitting across from each other, and they're like, well, why are we going through this? Why don't we entertain ourselves, have some hand-to-hand combat? Let's get some of your best men and some of my best men, and let's have them fight hand-to-hand. They'll entertain us. All right, so they pick 12 from each side, and they go at it, and what they do is, you got 12 men standing off on each side, and they all reach over, grab the other one's hair, and stab each other with a dagger in their side. So, all 12 on both sides, 24 people, boom, dead. So then fighting breaks out. There's a whole lot of fighting. In the midst of all that, I guess Abner sees the writing on the wall, because more of his men are dying than are dying from David's side. And he says, I guess I better hightail it up out of here. So Abner takes off running, and one of Joab's brothers named Asahel starts chasing him. And he said he was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. So this boy could run. And he takes off chasing after Abner and says he would turn neither right nor to the left. Meanwhile, Abner's running and looks back, and he sees this kid after him. He's like, hey, why are you chasing me? He said, why don't you turn to the right or the left? There ain't no need for you to die here today. The kid's like, can't do it. I'm going to run you down and kill you. He says, I'm telling you, you need to get off my trail. I'm going to have to kill you, kid. Kid's like, ain't doing it. So all of a sudden, Abner pulls up short, takes the butt of his spear and jabs it backwards through this guy's stomach until it comes out his back, and he falls dead right there. I can only imagine he's looking at him saying, I didn't want to have to kill you, but I told you, and you wouldn't stop coming. Meanwhile, so everybody comes up there and they see this kid laying there dead. They're like, oh, so they stop. They're like, okay, that's it. We're going to chase him down and we're going to kill him. Remember, this is Joab's little brother. This is one of the, Joab is the supreme commander of David's armies. And he had another brother there with him. And they make this, make the decision to chase Abner, and they're going to kill him. So they chase him and chase him and chase him. Abner comes to this hill. Let's see. The men of Benjamin rallied behind him, and they form themselves into a group, and they take their stand on top of the hill. Meanwhile, Joab and his men are coming up, and Abner hollers down to him. He's like, look, man, one of your brothers is already dead. Do we really have to do this? Why don't we just call it a day? Why don't you just go on home? We'll go on to our home. No more bloodshed today. And he says, and what he says, must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this is going to end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites? So he appeals to their family ties. Look, we're all from the same family here. We're all Israelites. Why are we killing each other? Joab says, as surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the man would have continued pursuing you until morning. So he blows his trumpet and they take off. So the final tally of the bloodshed, 19 of Judah's troops died that day, but 360 from Israel died. So, I mean, it's a pretty lopsided victory. Joab and his army, well, let's see, where does Abner go? I don't see where it says where Abner go, but Joab and his troops go back to Hebron, which is where King David's at. We have, in chapter 3, it tells us that this war between David and Saul's houses lasted a very long time. Meanwhile, David keeps growing stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul keeps getting weaker and weaker. At some point during this war between the two houses, Abner had been really working on strengthening his own position under King Ishbosheth. But just out of the blue, that was a nice kill there, buddy. You're taking your, I mean, this guy was like Mr. Miyagi, just killed that fly right there. Didn't do it with chopsticks, but, and that's forever immortalized in the video too. So Abner is strengthening his position as supreme commander of King Ishbosheth's army. But out of the blue, King Ishbosheth comes to him and says, hey, you know, my father had a concubine. Why have you slept with her? Abner's like, what are you talking about? I haven't slept with any concubine of your dad's. And Abner gets very angry and he says, look, what am I, a dog's head? I've been very loyal to the house of your father and to your family. I haven't handed you over to David, which I could. And this is what I get. You accuse me of an offense involving this woman. He says, you know what, I've had it. I'm out of here. I'm going to go and defect over to David's side, and I'm going to install David as the king over Israel. I think in a lot of societies, I mean, even if you think about it, even in our own country, we put a lot of stock in our supreme leader and our president of the United States, right? But the president is one man. Can the president be overthrown by our military right easily if the military wanted to? I bet you he could. I bet you the military could take out the president without even thinking about it. And in most societies that way. So basically Abner's saying, look, you might be the king, but I have the power. He says, when I go over to David, things are going to change, and David's going to become the king. And it says King Ishbosheth never talked to him again. He was very scared of him. He says, did not dare say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him. So Abner sends messengers to King David, and basically tells David, hey, I want to come see you. I want to make an agreement with you. I will help bring all Israel over to you. In other words, I'm going to help you unite the entire people of Israel under you alone as the king. David sends messengers back, and he says, you know what? That sounds like a good idea, but I got a condition. You know, I had a wife, a daughter of Saul's named Michal. And when I had to run away when Saul was trying to kill me, I heard that he took her and gave her to another man as his wife. I want her back. Man, she was my first wife, and she's probably my favorite, so I want her back. So King Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband. A guy's name was Paltiel. Now, this poor fella, if you can imagine it. So he's got a beautiful wife. He's happy with his wife. The king sends somebody, takes his wife away from him. He doesn't even put up a fight, but it says he followed behind her, weeping behind her all the way to this town. And Abner says, man, just go back home. Don't worry about her anymore. She's not your wife anymore. And you know what? Instead of fighting for her, you know what he did? He turned tail and went back home. Not much of a guy there. I would have fought for my wife a little bit. Abner, meanwhile, confers with the elders of Israel, and he says, look, I know some of you wanted to make David king for a while. Well, here's our chance. We're going to form a delegation. We're going to go over there, and we're going to make this thing happen. He also spoke to the Benjamites, and they decided to go over there. So Abner takes 20 men with him, goes to David at David's town of Hebron. David prepares him a feast, and they make a covenant, and David sends Abner away in peace. Let's see. Well, hold on. There was let me go once and make a covenant with you. So, okay. David sends Abner away, and Abner goes away in peace. Meanwhile, Joab is out on a military campaign, and he doesn't know this is going on. So he gets back in town, finds out that Abner, his counterpart on the other side, his enemy, has been in town sniffing around. And he goes to David and says, David, what the heck is going on? You had him right here in the camp. You could have killed him. David's like, it's not like that. You know, we've got a treaty now. We've got a covenant. He's going to help make me king of all of Israel. And Joab's like, I can't believe what a fool you are, king. That's not what he's here for. He's here to spy out, to see what I'm doing, to where he can come up with a battle plan. He's going to come here and overthrow us. And he doesn't confer with David, but he withdraws and he comes up with a plan. He says, I got to handle this Abner situation. So he sends messengers out after Abner and says, hey, tell him the king wants him to come back to Hebron. We still have something to discuss. So the messengers go out, get Abner. Abner, who he was just there and had a feast with David, has no reason to suspect anything's wrong. He goes back to Hebron. He gets back to Hebron, and Joab says, hey, Abner, before you go see King David, let's step over here to the side real quick. I got something I need to tell you. When he goes to the side, stabs him, kills him. Now, he killed him, number one, because he was an enemy or a perceived enemy to David's kingdom. But he also killed him because this was the guy that killed his little brother not too long ago with the butt of a spear, right? Later, David hears about this, and he says, hold on now. I did not order this. This is not what I wanted. He said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner. That's on you, Joab. You and your whole family are going to have to bear the curse from this. And he actually pronounces a curse. He says, may Joab's family never be without somebody who has a running sore or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food. Basically, he says, your family is doomed for a while. Then David told Joab and all the people to tear their clothes, put on sackcloth, and walk in mourning in front of Abner. They buried him, buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud. They all come together and tell David, come on, you got to eat something, king. You've been mourning all day. He's like, nope, I'm not going to eat anything until the sun goes down. Well, the Israelites, the people from the northern kingdom, from Ishbosheth's kingdom, they hear that, and they're kind of pleased with it, like, okay, this guy gets it, you know. He's got a good head on his shoulders. And that's when they decide that that they can follow this guy, that they're going to be okay following him as the king. We have, now, okay, when you live by the sword, you die by the sword. So Ishbosheth, who was the son of Saul, he heard that Abner died in Hebron, and it says he lost courage. There were two men, and I'm not sure where they were from, but their names are Rechab and Baanah, and they set out for Ishbosheth's house. Now, nobody has sent them. They decided to take this mission on their own. So they go to Ishbosheth's house. Now, Ishbosheth is in his house, and he's taking a little midday nap. I'm guessing just filled up his belly with a good lunch and heavy eyelids. He lays down and takes a little nap. And these two go into the house, and they sneak into his bedroom when he's laying there in bed sleeping, and they stab him and kill him. Not only do that, they cut off his head. They take his head and they travel all night long until they get to Hebron, and they go to David with his supposed enemy's head, King Ishbosheth, and they're like, look what we got. You are now the king of everybody in Israel because your counterpart is dead. And I'm sure they're thinking, man, this is great. King David is going to be so pleased with us. I mean, he's going to reward us. He's going to give us everything we desire. Well, David, this is his answer. He says, when somebody told me that Saul was dead and he thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and had him killed. How much more severely do you think I'm going to deal with you because you snuck into an innocent man's house and cut off his head while he was sleeping? And so he orders, gives the order to his men to have them killed, and they're killed. Then what he has them do is he has them cut off their hands and feet and hang their bodies by the pool there in town. Meanwhile, he gives Ishbosheth's head a proper burial. So kind of ironic there. They think they're doing something great. They end up being dishonored, killed, hands and feet cut off, and body hung on a pole out there. And the man that they killed, at least his head, is given a decent burial. Let's see. I think I'll run ahead of myself a little bit. Yes, I have. All right, I'm catching up. Now, chapter 5. The kingdom becomes united. Chapter 5 tells all the tribes of Israel, they come down to David at Hebron, and they're saying, look, we're your people, you're our kind of guy. When Saul was over us, you're the one that led us to all these victories. The Lord said to you that you're the one that's going to shepherd his people. Is everything okay, Mike?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Just checking. You're going to be our guy. You're going to be our king. So all the elders of Israel come to King David at Hebron. They made a covenant, and they anointed David king over all of Israel. So Saul, in theory, had a united kingdom. But after he died, the kingdom kind of split. Half of them go to David, half of them go, well, I say half, but part of the kingdom goes to David, part of it goes to Ishbosheth. David reunites them, and he was king, I think it says, 7 years over Judah. 7 years and 6 months he rules from the town of Hebron. Now he's the king of all Israel, and he sets his sights a little bit higher than some little old backwater town called Hebron. He says, we need a new place to reign. So he goes up to this thriving metropolis of Jerusalem. Now, when we think of Jerusalem in modern day terms, we're like, oh yeah, that's the nation of Israel. That's Jerusalem. That's where the temple and everything was. Well, back then, it still belonged to a group of their enemies that they were supposed to completely wipe out when they first go into the promised land, called the Jebusites. So the Jebusites owned Jerusalem. David goes up against it, and they start taunting him because it's a fortified city. Oh, you can't get in here. Shoot, even somebody blind or lame can whoop on you from out there. And David says, all right, okay, we'll see who's blind and lame. Well, David knew that there was a tunnel, a water tunnel, to get into the city. And so he sends his men in through that water tunnel, infiltrates the city, and overthrows and conquers the Jebusites. Now, it was a difficult task, but David ends up getting the job done. And it becomes known as the city of David because David conquered it. And we see that term throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, the city of David. And it's interesting what a role Jerusalem plays. We can go back to Genesis when Abraham was called to sacrifice his son Isaac. Where do you think that mountaintop where that sacrifice was going to take place? It was what is now Jerusalem. So many things have happened there. When Melchizedek comes out, and Melchizedek, we see him in Genesis, but we also see him in the New Testament in Hebrews. He is a powerful figure. In fact, the author of Hebrews compares Jesus to Melchizedek. He's a high priest on the order of Melchizedek. Well, Melchizedek was the king of Salem, which predates Jerusalem. So some awesome things have happened here, and now we finally see it in Israelite hands. This is the city of David, the city of Jerusalem, and it is now the new capital, as it were, of Israel. Now, Joab is the one that ends up leading the assault, and he becomes the chief captain of all of David's troops. David's fame continues to increase. The king of Tyre, which is a city on the Mediterranean coast, hears of all this, and he sends an envoy to David. He sends along cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons. And in this brand new captured city, they build David a temple out of cedar and stone. So now David's got a proper place for a king to live. So he's got a temple. Then we have, he takes more wives and more concubines. He gets some sons and daughters, and those are named, but they're not really all that important. David goes on and defeats the Philistines. He fights a war, a couple of battles with the Philistines, and of course he ends up victorious because God's on his side. Meanwhile, the Ark of the Lord has been kind of absent for a while. We haven't really traced where it's at. Well, it's in this town called Kiriath Jearim, or in Hebrew, it's called Baalah, which means the Lord. Well, no, it did not mean that. Basically, it's just another name for Kiriath Jearim. So it's hanging out in this town, and David's like, you know what? I've got a good city now. I've got the kingdom united. I've got the Philistines on the run. My enemies are at my feet. It's time to bring the ark of the Lord to a proper place. He says, it's time to bring it to Jerusalem. So he goes down. They build this new cart for it to ride on. They put the ark on the cart, hook up a couple of oxen to it. The chief priest, Abinadab, had two sons named Uzzah and who else was with him? What was his brother?
Gibeah.
No, Ahio. A-H-I-O. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab. They're guiding this new cart with the ark of God on it. And David and all of Israel are celebrating with all their might before the Lord. They're playing musical instruments, and they're just having a wonderful, worshipful time as this cart makes its way back towards Jerusalem. Well, when they get to this place called Nacon, they're coming to the threshing floor there. One of the oxen stumbled, right? And so it kind of jostles the cart. Well, Uzzah reaches up to steady the cart, lays a hand on the cart. And I still cannot reconcile this in my mind. I don't understand why. But the anger of God burned hotly against him, and he struck him dead. All because he reached up and steadied the ark where it didn't fall off the cart. Now, some thinks that was, right? Hey man, I'm just trying to keep your house from falling over, and you strike me and kill me dead. Well, if we go back to Numbers 4, when God is giving us he's giving the instructions to Aaron and to the Levites about who would be doing what, he was very specific that Aaron and Aaron's descendants would be the only ones that would be able to really know God intimately by going into the Holy of Holies and by seeing all these holy things. Anybody else that's looked at or even touched anything they weren't supposed to, God says, I swear to you, you look at it wrong, you touch it, you're going to die. That's the only thing I can do is connect those two. Is God was so serious about what he said about the Holy of Holies and the holiest things. And think, there was the Ark of the Lord lived within the Holy of Holies. Only the chief priest could approach that thing. Nobody else could go in that room other than the priest or somebody the priest brought in with him. And so when this upstart young kid reached up to catch it, even though he was well-intentioned, God's like, look, I said what I said and I mean what I said. And he struck him dead. Well, David gets angry because the Lord's wrath breaks out against this kid. And David gets afraid of God and says, you know what? If that's the kind of God that that this represents, I don't know if I want that kind of God up in Jerusalem. That's kind of scary. And so he sends it to the house of a guy named Obed-Edom. And it stays there for 3 months. David goes back to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, God is blessing this man's household because the ark's there. Well, David gets word about the blessings that the Lord is putting on Obed-Edom. And David's like, okay, maybe it's time to bring the ark up here. I need some of them blessings up in Jerusalem. And so he goes down and he collects the ark, and he's starting to bring it up. And David is so ecstatic about this that the cart only moves, the people carrying the cart only take 6 steps and then they have to stop. And guess what? Because he's offering an offering. He's sacrificing a bull and a fatted calf every 6 steps. Now imagine. I mean, you must really, really have a heart for God that you're only going to take 6 steps. All right, everybody stop. Somebody bring in a bull and a fatted calf. Got to slaughter them. Make a sacrifice. He's wearing a linen ephod, which would have been the garment that the priests were supposed to be wearing. David's not a priest, but he's wearing a priestly garment. And he is dancing before the Lord with all his might, which, for the life of me, reading this, I don't understand how Baptists can think that dancing is a bad thing and an evil thing, because Baptists don't allow dancing, right? But here he is dancing with all his might as they bring the ark up with shouts and the sounds of the trumpet. As the ark is coming into the city of David, his wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, is watching from a window at the spectacle coming into town, and she sees her husband leaping and dancing before the Lord, and it says she despised him in her heart.
There's your reason.
Oh, well, it's not very theologically sound, but right? She's looking at that spectacle he's making of himself, and she calls him out in a minute. So they bring the ark in, set it in its place inside this tent that David sets up, make sacrifices. Once all the sacrifices are done, David blesses everybody, gives them gifts, and sends them home. Then he goes to his house to bless his own household. He comes in, and his wife's standing there going, "Can't believe what I saw out there. Boy, the great David dancing around half naked in front of all the slave girls. Boy, what a sight that was." And David says, you know what? It wasn't before the slave girls I was dancing. It was before the Lord. And he says, and then he pours a little salt in that wound. He says, the Lord who chose me over your dad. Ooh. This man, he wanted to sleep on the couch, is what it was. He says, I will celebrate for the Lord, and I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. He says, but guess what? Those slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. They're going to see me in honor. Which, real quick, I'm just going to point ahead to the New Testament. When Jesus comes, even Jesus himself says that he comes to bring the gospel that the kingdom of God had come near to who? To the Israelites, to fellow Jews, right? The woman comes to him and says, Lord, please help my daughter. And he says, hey, what I've got, I'm offering to the children of God, not to dogs. And she goes, well, don't dogs even eat scraps off the table? And he has compassion on her and says, your faith has made you well, go and your daughter's healed. But his message was for the Jews. After he is crucified, the apostles go to the Jewish people to, try to convince them that Jesus was the Messiah and that, that these things have been fulfilled. It isn't until the Jews start acting like Michal and say, we don't like what's going on here. We reject this. We don't. And then they start taking the message to non-Jews, what we call the Gentiles. He says, look, so you're so high and mighty, you don't like me dancing before the Lord? Well, good. Well, then slave girls will honor me for dancing before the Lord. Think about when Jesus is coming in and everybody's like, oh, Jesus, oh, Hosanna in the highest. And the uppity-uppities of the church, the high priest and everything, are like, Jesus, why don't you shut your followers up? Man, they're bordered right on blasphemy there. He's like, why would I shut them up? If I shut them up, the stones will cry out, when they're down by the Jordan River and John the Baptist is baptizing people, getting ready for Jesus, and and all the church leaders come down, all stuff sure come down there. And, what's going on down there? And he's like, you brood of vipers, who told you to come down here looking around? He says, and don't even bother saying that you have Abraham as your father, because, that doesn't mean nothing. God will raise up sons of Abraham from these rocks over here. So we see the beginning of this design motif here, where, Michal, she comes from a lineage of kingly lineage for Saul as her father. She's married to David, who's a king, and yet she is mortified that her husband put on such a spectacle, pouring his heart out in praise for God. And he's like, well, if you won't, accept that, those slave girls you despise so much will. And then God punishes Saul's daughter, and she has no children to the day of her death. So she bears no children, which we talk about it. In those days, that was a big thing. If a woman couldn't have a child, something was thought to be wrong with her and was being punished by God. So, chapter 7, moving right along. Wow, I really got into that story there. David gets settled into his palace, and the Lord gave him rest from all his enemies. So he tells his resident prophet Nathan, he says, man, I've got a really great temple. Here I am living in this wonderful house of cedar and all that, but yet the ark of God remains in a tent. He said, man, that just doesn't sound right, does it, Nathan? He says, man, I think I ought to do something about it. And Nathan says, I tell you what, whatever king you have in mind to do it. The Lord will be with you. Well, he didn't bother asking God what God thought, because that night Nathan goes and lays his head down on his pillow, and God comes to him and says, Nathan, here's what I really want you to tell David. And basically what it boils down to is, I've been with you, I've been moving place to place ever since I brought my children up out of Egypt. He says, have I ever asked anybody to build me a house? No. He's like, there will come a time for that, but now's not the time, and David's not the guy. We'll find out a little bit later why David's not the guy, and it's because he's got so much blood on his hands from, even though he's killing in the name of God, remember, God is a holy and a righteous God, and there's got to be separation between what is not holy and what is holy. Having blood on your hands from killing people, you're not supposed to be touching dead bodies, or you're ceremoniously unclean as an Israelite. He says, I'm going to have your son Solomon build a temple for me. But in the meantime, things are going to just be peachy keen for you. Things are going to go great. You're going to have peace. You're going to have prosperity. And when you die, I'm going to continue on your line forever. Basically, the line of David will always have a ruler in Israel. So Nathan goes and reports all of it that God revealed to him to David, and David's response is a deep, fervent prayer to God. And I'm not going to really go into this beautiful poetry, it's all there, but basically he's just pouring out his heart to God about how awesome God is, thanking him for all he's done, and talking about what a trustworthy God he is. Chapter 8, David has a series of victory over all of his enemies. They're kind of recorded here. He defeats the Philistines. He defeats the Moabites. He goes against the Syrians. He defeats this guy named Hadazer. There we go. Say it like you want it. Hadazer, king of Zobah. And he goes to restore his monument. Let's see. Or control along the Euphrates River. So basically what we're getting here is a portrait of David expanding the kingdom past what the original tribal lands that were given to, that God gave to the Israelites. David is expanding upon that. He is going out of those bounds and conquering these people along the way. He ends up subduing Syria, which is up north of Israel's ancestral lands, Moab, which is to the east, Ammon and Edom, which are kind of to the, I believe, I don't have a map with me, but I think they're the southeast and the southern part of their, out of their borders. And he's just going to town. He's having great success wherever he goes to battle because the Lord is with him. After that, chapter 9, David asks, he says, is there anyone still left in the house of Saul who I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Two reasons why he wants to honor somebody from Saul's house. Number one, he made a promise to his friend Jonathan that he would honor Jonathan. Even though he was at odds with his father Saul, him and Jonathan were very close friends, and he promised that he would honor Jonathan. He also made a promise to Saul, so after I believe the second time that he could have killed Saul, Saul's like, look, I know you're going to become the king one day, just do me a favor, don't kill everybody in my family line. Leave at least somebody. Well, he inquires about it. He knows that Saul and all of Saul's sons are dead. He says, but there's got to be somebody left in that line that I can honor. So there is a guy named Ziba. He's a servant in Saul's household. So they bring him before King David. David's like, is there anybody left? He said, well, there's one of Jonathan's sons that escaped being killed. His name is Mephibosheth. There we go. That's how it's Mephibosheth. And he says, where is he? And he said, I've got him hid out at this one place. He said, well, bring him here. I want you to bring him here, and I want to honor him. Now, the thing about Mephibosheth is, as people were coming in to kill all of Jonathan's household, one of the female servants made an escape with him, but she trips and falls. Now, he's a young child at this point, trips and falls, and he gets injured in that fall, which caused him to be lame in his feet. Much like I talked about in our sermon this morning about having that physical infirmity of being blind, being lame in your feet would have also been something that you would have been a social outcast for that. You would have had to rely on others to do for you. I'm just saying, I mean, if you're paralyzed, basically the way I read this, he's probably paralyzed. He wouldn't have been able to go out and work the fields and all that. Well, David brings him in, and basically the guy's like, oh, it's the king. David's like, oh, don't be afraid, for I want to show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. He said, I'm going to restore to you all the lands that belong to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. So basically, anything that belonged to Saul is now going to Saul's grandson, Mephibosheth. And David's like, you're going to be my very honored guest from here on out. So David restores all the land. He actually tells that servant that told him about Mephibosheth, he's like, you guys are going to go out and work all this land for Mephibosheth. You're going to bring all the stuff in. And he's going to eat at my table for the rest of all time. In chapter 10, which is the last chapter we're going to do tonight, the king of the Ammonites, who David had defeated and had a treaty with the king, he dies. Now, David still kind of had a soft spot for him, and he says, you know what, king died, new king's coming in. I think I'm going to send a delegation over there just to, pay my respects that this guy's dad died. And tell him that we're still on good terms, and I'm going to honor the covenant that I had with his dad. So he sends a delegation to express sympathy to this new guy named Hanun concerning his father. Now, when David's men get there, the commanders tell the king, says, do you think David is really honoring you by sending this envoy? I think he's sending him over here to explore the city and to spy it out and to overthrow it. So the king seizes David's envoy, shave off half their beard. Now, the Israelite man's beard was something that was to be revered. So they don't shave the whole thing off, they just shave half of it off. I mean, imagine if I come in on Sunday morning with half a beard shaved off. That's bad enough, but guess what else they do? They cut their clothes off, exposing their butts, and send them packing. So these guys are coming back naked from the waist down, half a beard. I mean, just completely insulted David by humiliating his envoy. David hears about it before the messengers get back, and he's like, look, I know you're humiliated. You can't come back to Jerusalem looking like that. Go to Jericho. Hey, there's that town again. Go to Jericho, hang out there, get you a good set of clothes, stay there until your beard grows back out, and then you can come back. The Ammonites realize that they become obnoxious to David, so they go out and start hiring hired guns. They know they don't have enough troops to mount up a defense against Israel, so they go to all these other people groups all around. I mean, from up north, down south, everywhere, and they get thousands and thousands and thousands of these foreign troops to come in to help them. But in the end, they're no match for David's army, and they end up being annihilated, and that's the end of them. Well, that brings us to a natural stopping point, because in chapter 11, we get into the story of David and Bathsheba, which is a great place to start our study tomorrow night. But we got a pretty good glimpse tonight of David's rise to power, how God was with him in everything he did. We now see why Baptists don't like dancing, because it makes you look foolish. I don't know if that's a good theological reason, just because his wife got mad at him about it. But what do y'all think? What were some insights you guys gleaned from tonight's stories?
It seems to me like a lot of these people were terribly paranoid. They're always thinking, somebody's coming after me.
Yeah, and I think you're right, but I think given the culture they lived in, that rather than paranoia, it was good, healthy skepticism that kept them alive.
Reasonable.
Oh yeah. I mean, because the Israelites are known for sending in spies. When the first time they get to the promised land, before they mess up, they sent spies in the land, and the second time they go in, they send the 2 spies in that end up at Rahab's house. I mean, so that's how they did things back then, and not much has changed. You know, I guarantee you, our country has sent spies into places like China. I bet you we've got spies in China right now. I know China's got spies over here. So that's just the way things are done. And so, yeah, they were paranoid, but probably for good reason. The thing that strikes me, though, and I just got to say, see what you guys think about this. I got to go back to last week. Saul was trying to kill David. Why would David show so much respect for a man who obviously wanted him dead? What's your take on it?
Probably because it had to be fulfilled, something like that. Like, he knew that he was called by the Lord, and sometimes we do things that aren't always fun, or we have to put our pride aside, that kind of thing, to be able to love the Lord fully. So
he knew that, I'm just trying to paraphrase what you're saying. So he knew it was God's will, even though he had to put himself in danger to withhold killing him.
Right.
But remember, even when he was first selected as the shepherd, he was the one who was most obedient to God and followed everything. And they went through all the brothers. They're supposed to be a very strict family, but he was the one selected.
Yep.
And he took it very seriously.
Oh, yeah.
And he was way down the ladder.
He was number 8.
In inheritance there.
He would have basically got nothing once his dad died.
Right.
Yeah.
And David became the warrior king, I guess.
Oh, yes.
And I wonder if, like, Hopper went to the centurion and said to Jesus, if you'll just say the word, my son will be healed. Maybe being a warrior, even in his DNA makeup, he realized how important authority was.
Oh, yeah.
To where he was passing that forward.
Absolutely.
I'm just real confused about the first wife, because when they are first talking about her, it seems like they are so greatly in love,
Mm-hmm.
and she's upset when she's pulled away from him and given to somebody else. And then the tables have turned so much, and now she despises him. I guess she
Yeah.
blames him for the fact of her father's death.
Oh,
I
I,
don't
yeah,
know.
I'm thinking about it. Yeah, I've never really considered it, but you're right. Yeah, they were madly in love. He was willing to go out and kill twice as many
Yeah.
Philistines as what
Yeah.
Saul put a price on.
He just volunteered to kill.
200 instead of 100. And, you know, Saul was greatly disturbed because his daughter truly loved David, and that made Saul even more mad and jealous. And now here we find she despises him in her heart.
But then he didn't have the same forgiveness for her he did for Saul.
I mean,
Now
she-
Saul
Well, no,
wasn't-
he did not curse her.
She didn't.
Basically, he just said, he stood his ground and said, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. You know, I think you misunderstand.
Yeah, but he wasn't a man of God, so he wasn't
Who
supposed
was
to be
not a
doing
man of
that. I mean, he wasn't a Levite.
Right, yeah, well, to where he wasn't a Levite or a priest in the line of Aaron, so he wasn't supposed to be offering sacrifice. Wow, that's a great insight, because that's what got Saul in trouble in the first place, was he offered sacrifices that Samuel was supposed to offer. And yet here's David doing it and getting away with
And he's
it.
wearing the
The
religious.
ephod, yeah.
So I mean, you know, he starts slipping away right there.
But I wonder if it's really slipping away.
Well, I mean, it may be God's plan for,
Yeah. Well, if God's not rebuking him like to rebuke Saul, there's got to be a reason there.
yeah.
So,
Well, if David and Micah, the daughter of Saul,
McCall?
if they would have had children together, but she became barren. But if they would have had children, David's and Saul's houses would have been together.
Right. So what do you think the implications are of them not having children? Do you think that was God's ordained plan to keep the houses separate, to where the line of David remained distinct?
I hadn't given that much thought.
Well, I hadn't either until you brought it up, but I'm starting to wonder now. Because, remember, the line of David is really what we're following now. Now, we know that because we kind of know the end of the story with Jesus, but now that we know that and look back at this, I wonder, now, it's pretty clear the implication here, she's being punished for,
But it also gets rid of the bloodline.
it does, it gets rid of Saul's bloodline. Yeah, it dies there. And actually, the line continues. And it's funny, the line goes through, like I said, Tamar, I think I said this a couple of weeks ago, Tamar, who seduced her father-in-law when he wouldn't give up his third son to marry her after her previous two husbands died, goes through Rahab, who was a prostitute, it goes through Ruth, who was a Moabite, which was a mortal enemy of God said, look, Moabites can't come over here for like 10 generations. But yeah, it completely eliminates Saul's bloodline.
But the interesting thing is all these people who weren't supposed to be in there originally, look at all the Gentiles who wound up following Christ.
But we were always supposed to be in there.
Yeah.
All the way back to Genesis, God tells Abraham that he's going to be a father of many nations. He's going to be a light to all nations. His line is a light to all nations. So real quickly, and I know we're just about out of time, but if you look at Genesis, starts with the big picture, all of creation. Narrows it down by chapter 2 to just humankind. Everything else is ancillary or supporting for the human line. From humans, we kind of go back out, then we get to Noah, which narrows it back down, then it goes back out, and then in chapter 12 we meet Abraham. And from Abraham we get the 12 tribes of Israel, then we narrow in on the tribe of Judah, then we narrow in on the line of David, and then that takes us like an arrow. So we're starting here, and we're now on the line of David. So, but that was for a specific purpose, to get us to Jesus. Once we get to Jesus, Israel's purpose is fulfilled in bringing the Messiah. Now it's opened back up to all of humankind again, Jews and Gentiles. The reason that Jesus was trying to carry the message exclusively to the Jews is he was equipping them for the work of then carrying the message out. But they ultimately reject the message. Paul tries to continue on, even though God says, I will make you an apostle to the Gentiles. Everywhere he went, early on in his ministry, the first stop in any town was the synagogue, preaching to his fellow Jews. And when they're like, we ain't buying none of that, he'd usually set up shop, sometimes right next door, and preach to the Gentiles, and had great success. So yeah, we were always part of the plan. It just took a while to get there. But that's great insight. That is great insight. Well, that's about all the time we got for tonight. It's been a great study. I appreciate everybody coming together. This is really a lively group. You guys have great insights, and it's always a blessing to be here with you. No, you're certainly not shy. I bid you to go forth in peace, and we'll see you next week. Hey folks, remember to click the subscribe button below and ring the bell to be notified when we post new content. And as always, if today's video touched you in some way, please hit the thumbs up button and leave us a comment. We love to hear how our content impacts your walk with Jesus Christ. Until next time, God bless.